I've prepared the edited script but need file right permission to save it. Here it is directly instead. The water in the basement was at Iris Caldwell's chin, and she had maybe 40 seconds before it reached her mouth. She'd been standing on the bottom step when it happened. The old sump pump giving out with a sound like a cough, the backed-up groundwater surging through the foundation crack she'd noticed 2 winters ago and mentioned to no one. In seconds, what had been a knee-deep inconvenience became something else entirely. The single overhead bulb went dark, and Iris, 41 years old, a trained nurse who had kept her composure in emergency rooms for 16 years, felt the cold water creep past her jawline and understood calmly and completely that she was in serious trouble. Her arms swept the surface of the submerged shelf where her mother had always kept mason jars and seed catalogues and the occasional stray battery. She couldn't see anything. She could only feel, and what her fingers found on the third panicked sweep was metal. A handle, riveted military style, with a rubber gasket running the rim. Her frozen fingers closed around it and pulled. It did not want to move. She pulled again, throwing her weight backward, and felt the shelf bracket bend and give. Something scraped against concrete, the weight shifted, and Iris fought her way up the submerged stairs with a lockbox clutched against her chest and the water chasing her the whole way. She made it to the kitchen floor on her hands and knees, coughing brown water from her lungs, gasping, her vision grey at the edges. She lay there a minute, maybe 2. The April rain hammered the windows above her. Her sneakers were soaked through, her jeans plastered to her legs, her arms shaking from cold and adrenaline, and something she hadn't named yet. Then she looked at the box. Heavy, olive drab, the kind of thing you found at army surplus stores, built to be sealed against weather and water and time. The brass padlock was dark with age but intact. Iris got to her feet, went to the junk drawer her mother had kept in the same state of organized chaos for 30 years, and found the hammer right where it had always been. It took 6 strikes. The hasp sheared off on the 6th, rust flaking across the linoleum in a fine orange spray. What Iris Caldwell pulled out of that basement on the afternoon of April 9th didn't just keep her from drowning. It dismantled a lie that had been holding up her family's world for 35 years. But to understand what was in that box, you need to go back 3 weeks to a hospital room at Harlow County Regional that smelled like antiseptic and the carnations someone had brought and forgotten to change. Back to a woman named Helen, who had something she needed to say before she ran out of time. Helen Caldwell had been 68 years old and constitutionally incapable of being easy about anything. The pancreatic cancer that took her in 7 weeks had barely slowed her opinions. She'd disputed the thermostat with her nurses on a near-daily basis, sent back her pudding twice, complained, not unreasonably, that the television remote was mounted too far from the bed. But in the last hours, when the morphine had taken most of what was left, she found her daughter's wrist with a grip that surprised them both. "The box," Helen whispered, eyes almost closed. "Elwood's box. 3rd shelf on the left, bottom of the basement. A breath that cost her something. Don't let Vincent touch it." Iris had nodded and said, "Of course, Mom," and assumed it was the medication. Her grandfather Elwood had been dead since 1991, and Vincent Marsh, her stepbrother, who'd moved into the house when his father George married Helen and Iris was 9, was already handling the estate. Had been positioning himself to handle it for months, actually, ever since Helen's diagnosis. He ran a real estate development company. He knew attorneys. He understood documents. What Iris hadn't known, because no one had thought to tell her, was that Vincent had filed to be named sole executor of Helen's estate before her mother had even been in hospice 2 weeks, and that the estate in question included something considerably more significant than a farmhouse and a half-acre kitchen garden. 340 acres of agricultural land in Harlow County, flat, deep-soiled, federally classified as prime farmland. Ground that had been in the Caldwell family since before Iris's grandfather was old enough to drive a tractor. Iris had grown up on those fields. She'd gotten her first bad sunburn on them at age 12, baling hay in July with her forearms exposed. She'd assumed, the way you assume things about the place you came from, that the land was half hers, that when her mother died, as eventually she would, the property would pass to both of them. She'd also been laid off 3 weeks before her mother's diagnosis. Harlow County Regional had restructured its nursing staff. She had savings that covered 4 months of rent, a Civic with 112,000 miles on it, and no job prospects she was willing to look at too closely. She hadn't mentioned any of this to her mother, who was dying and didn't need the additional weight. And now Helen was gone, and Iris had driven down from her apartment in Indianapolis to collect a few of her mother's things, before Vincent moved forward with the estate, and she'd found the back field flooded from 3 days of hard rain, and the sump pump long dead, and she'd gone down there anyway because she could not stop hearing her mother's voice. The box. Don't let Vincent touch it. The rubber gasket had done its job. Everything inside was dry. Iris spread the contents across the kitchen table. 3 items, each wrapped in plastic sheeting and sealed with electrical tape so old it had partially fused to itself. She peeled each one open carefully, the way she'd once been trained to handle specimens, and laid them side by side. A sealed envelope marked Elwood. Do not open, unless. A red accordion folder with a rubber band that snapped to powder at her touch. A small leather journal, its cover soft with age. She opened the envelope first. The letter inside was in her grandfather's large, deliberate script, the handwriting of a man who'd gone to school in a one-room building and taken the act of writing seriously his whole life. Dated March 14th, 1989. Her wet hair dripped onto the page, and she tilted it away, the nurse's reflex to protect evidence. She read it standing up. She read it again sitting down. By the time she finished, both her hands were trembling, and it had nothing to do with the cold. Elwood had written it as an insurance policy, the way a man writes something when he's not long for the world and has stopped trusting the living to handle it after he's gone. Diagnosed with congestive heart failure in early 1989, 2 years before he died, he'd known. In the careful, deliberate way he'd known most things, exactly what his business partner was doing. George Marsh had been Elwood's partner for 20 years. They'd farmed adjacent land, borrowed each other's equipment, eaten at each other's tables at Christmas and on the 4th of July. When George fell into serious debt in the mid-1980s, Elwood had helped him, co-signed on refinancing loans, covered a bad season, done what neighbors did back then when neighbors still did such things. George, rather than feel grateful, had looked at everything Elwood owned and started quietly moving it into his own column. The letter named dates and parcels. Systematic forgeries, small enough to go unnoticed individually, carried out across 18 months between 1987 and 1988. George had found a county clerk named Delbert Oakes, his second cousin by marriage, to process the transfers without the usual scrutiny. Piece by piece, 340 acres of Caldwell land had been moved into a shell company George controlled, Midfield Holdings, LLC, a name that carried no obvious connection to the Marsh family. Elwood had discovered it. He'd confronted George, who denied everything with the smooth confidence of a man who believed he was the smarter one. Elwood then drove to Indianapolis and retained an attorney named Stuart Briggs, who verified the forgeries with professional documentation and urged Elwood to store his original deeds somewhere no one would think to look. Iris opened the accordion folder. The original deeds were there, all of them, on heavy cream paper bearing the Harlow County Clerk's embossed seal. Each dated 1952, registered to Elwood James Caldwell, unencumbered and uncontested. Behind them, photocopies of the fraudulent transfer documents, annotated by Stuart Briggs. Specific notes on where the forged signature deviated from Elwood's authentic samples, how the ink distribution differed, where the letter formation broke down under analysis. Behind those, a set of notarized witness statements. 2 of them, A field hand named Theodore Grubb and an accountant named Jean Pollard, both swearing they had personally watched George Marsh sign Elwood Caldwell's name to a transfer document in 1988, notarized August 3rd, 1989. The seals were intact. Theodore Grubb had died in 2003. June Pollard had died in 2011. But the statements hadn't died. They had waited in a waterproof box in a flooded basement under the house Iris had grown up in for 35 years. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at what her grandfather had built and what George Marsh had stolen, and what her mother had kept in silence for a lifetime, and she felt something settle into place in her chest that she didn't immediately have a word for. It wasn't rage, though rage was part of it. It was closer to recognition, the sensation of finally seeing clearly a thing she'd spent years looking at sideways. She had grown up calling George Marsh Uncle George. She had stood at his funeral in 2019, shaken the appropriate hands, said the appropriate things. And Vincent had inherited everything his father built, including, apparently, 340 acres he had no legal right to own. Her phone read 2:47 p.m. Her thumb hovered over Vincent's contact. She stayed very still for a moment, then she set the phone down. She knew Vincent. She'd watched him navigate 30 years of situations that required managing people, watched the warmth appear exactly when it was needed, and evaporate the moment the need passed. If she called him, he would come. He would look at the documents and tell her they were fabricated. He would call the people he knew at the county office, and there were people he knew at the county office, and whatever happened next would happen on his terrain, at his pace, in the direction he chose. She needed to be somewhere else entirely. She photographed every document, taking her time, making sure the seal and the notarizations and the signature analysis were all clear. Then she looked up a name her mother had mentioned once, years ago, in the context of a land dispute between neighbors that had resolved in a way nobody expected. Eleanor Forsyth, former Assistant Attorney General, State of Indiana, private practice, Crestfield. She found the listing. She called. Forsyth, one word, the voice of someone who doesn't pace around an introduction. Iris told her in 4 sentences who she was, what she'd found, what was sitting on her passenger seat, and what her stepbrother was doing with land he didn't own. 3 seconds of silence. How far out are you? 20 minutes. Don't stop for anything. Eleanor Forsyth was 73, 5'3", and carried the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where losing composure was a professional liability. She kept a pair of latex gloves in her desk drawer and put them on before she touched a single document. She read everything. She held the original deeds under her desk lamp and traced the embossed county seal with one gloved finger. She read the Grubb affidavit, then the Pollard affidavit. She read Elwood's letter start to finish without expression, then set it down and removed her reading glasses. I had a client, she said, who spent 8 years in court trying to contest a Harlow County land transfer from 1989, lost every round. The county deed records for that period were conveniently incomplete. She looked at the documents on her desk. These are not incomplete. Can we stop the signing? Iris said. Eleanor checked the clock, 3:44. Call your stepbrother. Tell him you found financial paperwork in the house and want to go over it together before the estate moves forward. Be vague. Sound confused. She was already reaching for her own phone. Give me 20 minutes. The call to Vincent was the strangest 2 minutes of Iris's recent life. His voice came on warm and easy, the voice of a man who believes he's the most prepared person in any room. She told him what Eleanor had suggested, sounding, she hoped, mildly overwhelmed and not at all dangerous. Of course. We'll sit down tonight, he said, and underneath the warmth she heard the half-second pause of a man recalculating. I've got a quick meeting this afternoon, but after that, absolutely. The quick meeting, $26 million, 5 o'clock. By the time Iris got back to Eleanor's office, 4 things were already in motion. A formal title dispute filed on behalf of the Caldwell estate with the Whitmore County Court. Authenticated document scans sent to the Indiana Secretary of State's Fraud Division. A colleague of Eleanor's reviewing the original deeds for an emergency hearing, and 2 state troopers Eleanor had apparently known long enough to reach by direct line. The filing went through at 3:58, Eleanor said, closing her laptop. Harriet reviewed the affidavits and issued a temporary restraining order on the title transfer. Meridian's legal team was notified at 4:02. She picked up her briefcase. Let's go. The Millhaven Town Hall lot had 3 black SUVs with Illinois plates and a Harlow County Gazette van at the curb. Someone had decided a $26 million signing ceremony was worth documenting. Iris sat in Eleanor's Camry a moment, looking at the building where she'd voted in every election since she was 18, where she'd watched her high school class collect academic awards in the gymnasium down the hall. She was still in the clothes she'd worn in the basement. Her sneakers had dried to a stiff, salt-stained gray. She looked exactly like someone who'd been pulled out of a flooding basement that afternoon, because she had been. She looked, in other words, exactly like the truth. The boardroom had been dressed for the occasion, a tablecloth over the folding tables, bottled water, a catered coffee service, slightly too elaborate for the room. 7 people from Meridian Ag Holdings sat on one side, 2 executives and 5 attorneys in suits that cost more than Iris's car. Local officials lined the back wall. The Gazette photographer had staked out a spot near the window. Vincent Marsh stood at the head of the table in a charcoal blazer with a pocket square, fountain pen in hand, smiling with the ease of a man who has already won and is rehearsing his gracious speech. He saw Iris the moment the door opened. The smile didn't disappear, but something behind it shut down, the way a light doesn't go out so much as change quality when you angle a shade. Iris, I thought we were talking tonight. I rescheduled, she said. Eleanor walked past her, set the briefcase on the table with a precise, deliberate sound, snapped both locks, and looked at the room. My name is Eleanor Forsyth. The room didn't require her to raise her voice. I represent the estate of Elwood James Caldwell. Before any document is executed, everyone on that side of the table needs to read what I'm about to hand you. The Meridian lead counsel, close-cropped hair, an expression calibrated for exactly this kind of situation, leaned forward. Who are you, specifically? Former assistant age, state of Indiana. Current counsel in an active title dispute over this property. Eleanor slid document packets across the table, 1 to each attorney. Your firm was served electronically at 4:02 this afternoon. I trust your associates have had time to review. One of the junior attorneys checked his phone, then leaned toward the lead counsel. She went very still. This is a stunt, Vincent said. His voice hadn't changed, but he'd set the pen down. She's my stepsister. She found some old papers in my stepmother's basement and decided. These, Eleanor said, laying the original 1952 deeds on the table, county seal facing up, are the uncontested registered deeds to the 340 acres you are currently attempting to sell. They were never legally transferred. Your father forged the transfer documents in 1988. We have contemporaneous notarized witness statements, expert signature analysis, and a personal journal in which Elwood Caldwell documented the fraud as it happened. A beat. You do not own this land, Mr. Marsh. Your father stole it, and you have been profiting from that theft for 35 years. The Meridian lead counsel stood. We need to stop this proceeding. Sit down, Vincent snapped. You are under contract. We're under a contract that assumed clean, uncontested title, she said, with none of the give of someone accustomed to being managed. This proceeding is suspended pending full legal review. Do not execute. She looked at Vincent with the flat assessment of someone closing a file. You'll be hearing from our fraud litigation team. The Meridian contingent gathered their materials with the brisk efficiency of people used to cutting losses quickly and cleanly. All 7 were moving within 45 seconds. the photographer's shutter clicking clear in the silence. Vincent watched his $26 million leave the room. He watched it with the stillness of a man whose insides hadn't caught up yet to what was happening outside them. Then something gave, visibly, a single moment of structural failure behind his eyes. He picked the fountain pen back up and pointed it at Iris. "You went into the basement." His voice had dropped to something almost private. "You actually went down there." "Mom told me where to look," Iris said. Mum. A sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She kept that box for 30 years. 30 years and never did one thing with it. "She was protecting herself," Iris said, "in a town your father owned. I don't have that problem anymore." He took a step toward her. The camera kept clicking. The 2 state troopers Eleanor had called came through the side door. Vincent Marsh was arrested at 4:57 p.m. on charges of deed fraud, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and misrepresentation in 3 prior estate filings. The cuffs went on in front of the local press, in front of the officials who'd shown up to shake his hand, in front of the Meridian attorneys already calling their own fraud division from the parking lot, and in front of Iris, who stood near the door in her dry, stiffened shoes and watched every second without looking away. What followed was neither simple nor quick, but it was thorough, because Eleanor Forsyth was thorough, and because the Indiana Attorney General's office opened an investigation that turned up 3 additional properties George Marsh had manipulated over a 20-year career of quiet, incremental theft. Vincent's assets were frozen within the week. His legal team withdrew after 4 months. He pled guilty to the fraud charge 18 months later and was sentenced to 4 years, with full restitution ordered to the Caldwell estate. On the morning the Harlow County Court issued the final title transfer, 340 acres of Caldwell farmland, registered in the name of Iris Marie Caldwell, she drove out to Millhaven, parked in front of the house, and sat a while with the window down. The fields were July green. The flooding that had nearly killed her was long erased by summer, the back 40 smooth and even, the soil dark with moisture. A neighbor had planted soybeans there as a courtesy, coming in clean and straight all the way to the fence line. The sky held that particular Indiana blue that goes almost purple at the edges in late afternoon. She'd grown up here. She'd left. She'd come back to bury her mother and found, underneath the grief and the exhaustion, something she hadn't known she was still looking for. She got out of the car, walked up to the front door, and let herself in. The first thing she did with the land, once the legal dust settled, was commission an architect to convert the old cattle barn on the south end of the property. It took 14 months, more compromise than she'd expected, and a non-profit developer who asked better questions than she'd braced for. What opened the following October was called the Helen Caldwell Resource Center, and the parking lot on opening Saturday was fuller than anyone had planned for. It was for people in Harlow County who had nowhere else to turn. Families between paychecks, people whose heat had been cut off, people sleeping in their cars and not saying so, because in a town where everyone knew everyone, admitting that felt like the last thing you could afford to lose. There was a commercial kitchen, a small medical room Iris staffed with rotating volunteer nurses, and a quiet back room with a table and 2 chairs where someone from the county legal aid office sat twice a week. Iris ran the intake desk herself on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She didn't advertise it. In a town the size of Millhaven, she didn't need to. She had gone into that basement with nothing but a dead flashlight and her mother's last words. She came out carrying something heavier than any lockbox, the knowledge that the truth doesn't expire. It waits, patient and waterproof, buried under whatever someone believed was heavy enough to keep it down, until the moment you stop being afraid to go looking for it. So before you move on with your day, ask yourself, if your family had a box like that one, something sealed and stored and never spoken of, would you go into the water to get it? And once you had it in your hands, once you knew what was inside, would you walk into that room and say something? I think you already know what you'd do, and I think that's exactly why you stayed until the end. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button. It helps keep the drama reach the people who need to hear it. Share it with someone who knows that staying quiet never actually makes a thing go away. And if you're new here, subscribe, because every story on this channel is exactly this. Ordinary people, impossible moments, and the choices that define everything. We'll see you next time.